Hello and welcome to Essential Armagnac with me, Hannah Lamphere. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm going to be taking you on a journey through France to explore France's oldest spirit, Armagnac. Cheers. So to begin, my own personal journey with Armagnac began probably around 4 years ago, where I got to go and visit a whole bunch of distilleries. And for me, I think traveling to France felt like an ordinary thing to do. You know, it's only an hour away by flight. But when I got to Gascony after, being driven from the airport for a couple of hours, you slowly start to emerge into beautiful country roads, and the landscape is devastatingly beautiful. That first vision of the Pyrenees just pricking the skyline as you land in the countryside is just a wonderful feeling, and I could feel all of my cares and troubles melt away. I don't think you ever go to Gascony without making a plan to return, and that's certainly true for me. I've been back time and again, and I hope that one day you get to go too. So let me begin. Now, I wanted to maybe intersperse this session not just with some diagrams and some information about how the spirit is made, but also a few snaps of my time there as well, as you'll see. But first of all, to give you an introduction, Armagnac is one of many, many spirits that make up the rich tapestry of distillation history in France. I've borrowed this map off the internet just to sort of demonstrate to you, and you can see all of these fantastic liqueurs and brandies and eau de vie and so on. Absinthe. Look, Gascony is down here in the southwestern foot of France. It's a part of France that is perhaps a little bit more rural and rustic. Life is very easygoing and very slow here. And the people of Gascony are incredibly generous, incredibly warm, and incredibly welcoming. And I think that's something that the spirit of Armagnac really shows too. It has a generosity to it. So let me take you to my next slide. These are some holiday snaps, I suppose, taken in the vineyards of Gascony. I chose this picture of cows not only because they are the most beautiful cows I've ever seen in my life, the cows of Chateau Pellereau, but also just to show you the kind of biodiversity and rich agriculture of the region, because it's not a very commercial spirit, Armagnac. And I think, if you visit Cognac, you'll see that the entire region is kind of dedicated to this spirit. But rather in Gascony, Armagnac is just part of something that people do. And while there are commercial distilleries who are entirely in the business of making Armagnac, it's not uncommon for huge portions of the eau de vie that make up Armagnac to be distilled by really small producers who might be keeping geese, keeping duck, growing grain to feed their poultry. Maybe they are growing onions or garlic. And definitely if they're making Armagnac, they'll be making a simple table wine. And of that table wine, they'll be getting some distilled. And this is a fantastic insurance policy where you can put a barrel of Armagnac in the cellar, and then if you need to pay for a wedding or get a new tractor, you can sell some to a negociant, and it's almost like cash in the bank. Now, just to show you a little bit about the region, and this is certainly not an opportunity to pit Cognac against Armagnac, but rather to show the differences of where they come from. These are both beautiful spirits that I adore, and also tell you something about the differences between them as well, and what makes Armagnac unique and distinct. Here in green, shaded below, and thanks to the WSET for the loan of the slide, this is Armagnac, and it's split into three: Basse Armagnac, Ténérez, and Haut Armagnac. Of the three sub-regions, Basse Armagnac dominates the production, but you will also find fantastic Armagnacs made in Ténérez and a very small number in Haut Armagnac. What makes these regions distinct from each other is really soil type. Basse Armagnac has got these very sandy soils. Ténérez have got these rockier soils with more limestone to them, and Haut Armagnac has limestone and clay. And just to demonstrate that, this is what the soil types look like. Now, each will kind of cultivate different grapes better, and the soil type is a starting point for the style of Armagnac, I suppose. A sense of terroir, the aspect of the vineyard, the type of soil that it has, and then also the hand of the person that cultivates them. So just to show you quite quickly an overview of how any fruit spirit made from grapes will be made, we're going to start off with the fruit. Armagnac is, of course, a grape spirit, and we'll talk more about the diversity of those grapes in a moment. Those grapes must be picked super fresh and in top quality condition. Whilst it might be possible to view distillation as a method of using up a surplus of food, if you're using any kind of raw material that isn't in top quality condition, you'll end up with a distillate that's texturally imperfect and perhaps with unpleasant aromas. So the quality of your fruit is paramount. Now you must crush it, which is simply to break the skins and then press it to release the juice, and then you can begin with fermentation. These stages and steps must be really quickly done because you want to get your fruit to the fermentation vessel before bacteria have started to feast or spoil the fruit. So it's really essential that this is done nice and quickly so that the grape juice is nice and clean. The next steps, broadly speaking, would be pot still or column still, and we'll look at the wonderful spirits of Armagnac in a moment. They can be unaged, they can be oak matured, and Armagnac is quite unusual in the fact that these eau de vie can actually be bottled with simply inert maturation, and then finished and bottled, polished and readied for sale. So I'd like to introduce you to the grape varietals that are used to make Armagnac. And the wonderful thing about this spirit is the diversity in the raw material. Whereas with Cognac, Uni Blanc is more or less the sole grape that's used in that spirit. Armagnac's got much more, well, diversity is a good word to use because you'll get an abundance of different flavours from these 4 different grapes. Now, there are 10 authorised grape varietals. However, I would say that 6 of these are largely considered to be historic. Though there are producers that still grow these 6 grapes, they're not used in any serious volume at all. But these 4 that we've got on screen, Uni Blanc, Bacco, Colombard and Fol Blanche are used. Uni Blanc, like with Cognac, makes up more than 55% of the plantings, and for good reason, because it is a grape that does what it's told. It's very well behaved. It grows easily with an abundant fruit, and its high acidity is ideal for the low alcohol wines preferred for distillation here. Those large open bunches make it very resistant to pests, mildew, mold, and it is that resistance that makes it a workhorse. Now, moving on to the next grape that makes up 35% of the plantings is Bacco. Bacco is a very unusual grape varietal because it is a hybrid. Hybrid grapes are not really permitted in France and very much frowned upon, but Bacco actually was a saving grace. Now, back in the 1970s, as steamships got faster, as ocean travel got faster, a little louse called phylloxera was mistakenly imported from America into Europe, and it caused tremendous devastation, completely destroying the vineyards of not just France, but the whole of Europe. Now, a school teacher that lived in Gascony started to try and find ways of genetically blending grapes to make a vine that was more resistant to this insect. And Bacco was a success story. It's a blend of Uni Blanc, an American vine called Noah, and actually the flavours that it creates are remarkable, and it's very much loved in Armagnac and considered to be an essential grape here, prized for its pruning characteristics, the body, the broad shoulders that it gives this spirit, even the toffee apple notes. This is a grape that will produce eau de vie that will happily have very long spells of maturation, so it's much prized. Colombard is said to give wines that are a little bit grassy, a little bit spicy, and then you've got Fol Blanche. Now, Fol Blanche, or the Fol, is a labour of love. If you are growing this grape, it's because you really want to. It is quite a tricky grape, difficult to graft, and it grows in very tight bunches, which means it's quite susceptible to mildew and mold. But it is these incredible lifted floral notes that it brings that, yeah, is a fantastic grape varietal used in Armagnac. If you ever try Blanche Armagnac, quite often it is 100% full Blanche. It's a lovely way to show off those floral notes. Okay, so a little bit about the vinification of the base wines. Ordinarily, if you were making a wine to bottle, you would be using sulfur dioxide in order to protect the grapes and protect the wines, preventing them from spoilage. Now, when it comes to vinifying wines that are going to be used in distillation, you absolutely cannot use this, because sulfur dioxide, it will be concentrated in distillation to the point that it becomes harmful. So these are very natural wines. They are typically quite high in acidity. They must be low ABV. Now, when we are distilling, we are concentrating alcohol. So if we start off with a higher ABV wine and we are distilling it, if we are distilling that wine to, let's say, 70%, we'll be taking that aroma and flavour up to 70. And if we started with a wine at 10%, for example, then we've times that flavour by only 7. Whereas if we've got a lower ABV wine, let's use 7 as an example, and we are distilling it up to 70 ABV, then we will be timesing that alcohol but also flavour by 10. So the lower the ABV, the more flavour we'll get in the distillate. You may not chaptalize these wines, you may not add sugar, and you must not fine out the fine lees, because the fine lees are the spent yeast cells that give incredible floral and fruity flavours to the distillate. You can use purchased yeast. You could also even use a natural yeast that's on the skins of the grapes in order to stimulate the fermentation. And now let's take a look at the distilling equipment. Here is yet again another little holiday snap from me. This is a picture of one of the travelling stills that you'll often see driving around in Armagnac for distillation season. If you're unlucky enough to get stuck behind a tractor with one of these attached to it, then your journey might take a very long time indeed. I think they are just incredibly beautiful contraptions, and they're remarkably clever as well. They predate the coffee still. They were first patented in 1818. And the incredible thing about these stills is that they don't require any water in order to cool. So the condenser is not populated with water as its cooling agent, but rather wine. Now, distillation season will get cracking just after the grapes have been harvested, vinified, then distillation season will begin. And it's just as winter starts to draw in. And you can imagine these very rural parts of France where not a lot happens. Distillation is a real celebration. And while it starts to get cold and the weather's not so clement, you can gather around these stills and it's really cozy and warm inside the distillery. This is continuous distillation, so someone is tending to the still around the clock, and you'll even hear of husband and wife teams that will tag team with one another and high five, and husband will get on the still in the daytime or wife's doing it by night, and they're tending to the still both round the clock. So let's take a look inside it then, and I'll give you some more stats and statistics and facts and whatnot. 48 houses have their own alembic, and there are 5 travelling distillers. Now, these are families that have got a little fleet of stills, and if you are growing your own grapes and making your own wine, you could call them up and ask to have your wines distilled by them. It is these little short column stills that are really stylistically pivotal for Armagnac. And in fact, for any distillery, you have to have one of these and you must use it. You are also permitted to have a Charentais style pot still as well, but it makes a very small amount of production. So it is these short column stills that are considered to create the style. Normally when you see the word alembic, it refers to a pot still, but here, when it's called an alembic armagnacaise, this means that it is in fact a short column still. Okay, so here's a cutaway of how they work, and they're quite remarkable things really, because it is a continuous cycle where, if you can see on the right hand side of that diagram, in the lower portion of the still, there's an input pipe, and this pipe is carrying cold wine into what is called the condenser. That cold wine is cooling the vapor that is on the inside of the worm, which carries the distillate. And as that wine is warmed by the hot vapor inside the worm, it will travel upwards and move up into the next section, known as a wine heater. That wine is then going to be warmed again even further by the hot vapor inside the worm, until ultimately it travels all the way to the top of the wine heater, and it makes that journey left on that straight pipe towards the still. Now, at this point, it's met with the heat and the hot vapor that is inside that column still, and each one of these plates is acting, forcing reflux and rectification, and almost like a degree of separation. The hot vapor that is rising from the bottom of the boiler will be stripping the volatile compounds up, up, up. And these things will have anywhere, usually around 10 to 12 plates, but even up to 17 plates is permitted. And you will be retrieving the vapor at the bottom of the worm, so the vapor will travel up to the top of the column, to the right towards the condenser, and it will slowly be cooled by that wine, and then it is collected at the bottom of the condenser. They're just so incredibly efficient and just really remarkable in the way that they work. Now, the distillate will be very low ABVs normally, almost unheard of strengths, outside of perhaps things like Peruvian pisco, or I don't know, things like Sochu. These are very, very low distillation strengths, anywhere from 52 to low 60s is the norm, and then permitted is up to 72.4, but largely that upper limit is referring to the pot stills rather than these column stills. So if you've got 6 litres of wine at 10% ABV, you'll end up with a litre of eau de vie at 60. And just to bring that point to light to you, I wanted to refer to this slide that I use in my WSET education also, which is this idea that the distillation strength of the spirit is directly pinned to how flavourful that spirit will be. And I think of this as like a seesaw, right? So if one is low, then the other is high. If distillation strength is high, then our flavour intensity will be correspondingly very low. For instance, neutral spirit is called neutral. It's distilled all the way up to 95 or 96 ABV, and it has a super low aromatic intensity. But then as we sort of lower the ABV of the distillation strength, we will get increasingly more and more flavour, right? So think of it as like a seesaw. Now, when we're talking about Armagnac, we are talking at the very lower end of the scale of distillation strength. These are pronounced in aromatic intensity, and our pronounced scale begins at 60, but Armagnac will go even lower than that. So these are spirits that are even more flavourful than those distilled on pot stills. So once we have our distillate, our incredibly flavourful, low distillation strength spirit, it will be water white, it will be colourless. Now it's time to put it into a barrel. And first of all, your barrel will be oak. It's quite common in this region to use Gascon oak, or what's called black oak, from local forests, but there will also be oak sourced from other forests in France, the royal oak forests, such as Limousin and Tronchet. Now, I just wanted to take a moment to talk about the way that barrels are made, because I think they are just so interesting and remarkable, and the history is fascinating. Long before barrels were considered to be important for their flavour-giving properties, they were simply just vessels, places that you put heavy things, and it could be anything. It didn't have to be a liquid. It could be absolutely anything at all would be stored in a barrel. But the benefit of them was their shape. Meant you could tip them on their side and then give them a push and roll them places. And this enabled people to send their stock and sell things to much further afield than before. So they were a remarkable human invention. Oak, in fact, was selected for liquids because it is the most watertight of the woods. The way that this oak is prepared is, well, you will cut down your tree, and then the next step is to cut this tree into short planks and allow these staves to weather. So you can see in the top right corner, this is, you know, a good cubic meter of oak that has been left outside, and it will just sit there for up to 3 years or even more. The rain will fall on it, and that kind of gentle weathering will leach out any of the bitter tannins or the green tannins. And after this time, once the wood is fully seasoned, it's ready to be prepared. And the production of the barrel will be to shape these planks into staves so they are slightly narrower at the ends, and fit them into a ring or into a hoop. And we'll see in a moment how the barrel is shaped. Interestingly, I think, you know, that the forests of France were incredibly important in the success of the French nation. And in fact, many of the trading nations that, you know, accrued wealth through to oceanic trading did so on the back of good forestry, and oak trees were used to create ships. And if you had ships, you could fight wars and you could go and trade. And these are the royal forests of France. Limousin and Tronçais are much prized for their wood and that its tight knit grain. Oh, here's a picture I was looking for. So once you fit all of your staves into a hoop, the other staves will be pointing outwards, and you need to bend them in so you can get the hoop on the other side. Now, the traditional way to do this is to make a brazier and warm up the barrel. But it is this heating of the barrel that enables you to bend the wood, which would otherwise splinter and crack. But it also will toast the interior, and you'll get the breaking down of the hemicellulose and the kind of this is basically activating the barrel so that the spirit can start to absorb some of these compounds. And then you will also get a toast. And you can see on this picture on the right, this is 3 staves from a light toast, a medium toast to a deep toast. Now, your producer, when you are purchasing barrels from the cooperage, will specify how deep they would like the toast to be. Now, charcoal will give a deeper colour, the greater the char, but it also has a special ability to help fine out some of the impurities in the spirit. Armagnac is a spirit that doesn't have the same separation of heads and tails in the distillate because of the way it is distilled. So a way of giving further finesse to the spirit is to age it, mature it, and barrel out any imperfections. Putting spirit into a wood will give it colour, it will give it congeners. These are the flavour compounds that could be things like giving us flavours like vanilla or spices. We can also get oxygen, which permeates these very tiny spaces between the staves. It can permeate up at the top of the bung, and it can also even permeate to a lesser extent through the grain of the wood itself. Now, that oxygen is a reactive compound, and it will react with these congeners from the wood, and over time it will give us real significant evolution in the spirit. And this is really where the flavour of aging comes from. As that Armagnac is sat there in cask, it is constantly losing volume. The Angel's share in Gascony is quite a lot a year. You know, you're losing perhaps 3 to 4% of the spirit year on year. But that evaporative loss is going to be made up of many of the flavourless compounds, things like water and alcohol. And you are left with the spirit on the inside becoming progressively more and more concentrated as it sits there. And texturally, it will become much more soft and integrated and oily and rounded. And there is that point I've made. The char will help remove some of the sharper congeners. Now, these are some of the compounds that come from the wood. We will get vanilla flavours from the vanillins, spice notes like clove or nutmeg or cinnamon from the eugenol, coconut notes from lactones, and the tannins in the wood. These are these astringent compounds that give us grip and give us structure to the spirit. So, the French approach maturation in a different way, because what you might know of whiskey in Scotland or whiskey in America, this is very much static aging, i.e. you are distilling your spirit putting it straight into a barrel, and then you leave it there for the entirety of its life. In Gascony, in Armagnac, what's done is that the spirit will be distilled, and that new spirit is likely to go into a new barrel, and that new barrel will have maximum amount of structure and flavour to give, and that will give this spirit some grip and some texture, and it's this structure that's given it early on, and then it will be rebarreled into a slightly older barrel and then a slightly older barrel. Now, something that is often an active goal is to create these flavours of rancio. Rancio as a word indicates these desirable flavours of decay, and they begin to start to take place after a good sort of 15 years in cask, and you'll get these flavours like spice start to then meld and become things like Christmas cake, fruit cake, cedarwood, cigar box, then old furniture, furniture polish. You'll start to get aromas such as curry leaf, which I found in a really old Armagnac the other day. And even some of these crazy tropical fruit notes like passion fruit will appear after a really long time spent in wood. Now, these are remarkable, almost alchemical interactions that take place, and they seem to take place, almost by magic, but actually it is some specific conditions that encourage this development. Longer fermentation will create greater esters, or these fruity flavours that will create fatty acids. And coupled with a long time spent in barrel, and particularly when you have these older casks, which allow a little bit more air in, and perhaps damp warehouse conditions, you'll end up with these complex flavours that build, stack and layer. Now, oak maturation is not necessarily the only way that Armagnac is stored. You could also potentially use an inert vessel, meaning inert, no reaction is taking place between the spirit and that vessel. For example, you could use a stainless steel vat, and these are commonly used when making Blanche Armagnac, which must have a minimum of 3 months spent in these inert vessels. Now, the reason behind this is that any distillate will be a little bit prickly, let's say, after distillation, but it is that inert maturation that allows the spirit to soften, and it will find an integrity and a roundness through that rest. The other way that inert vessels are used could be these glass demijohns that are used in order to arrest oak maturation. So let's imagine that our spirit has spent 40 years in cask, and all of that time it has been evaporating, and you are losing quite a substantial amount of the volume every single year. And also at a certain point, the oak extractors in the wood might begin to overwhelm the fruit itself of the distillate. So the distiller or the maitre de chai, the master blender, might be tasting the barrels periodically to make sure that they are reaching their best. And at the moment that they think any further maturation would take them too far, they will choose to decant them and then store them in glass. Now, these glass demijohns are then put in a part of the cellar known as a paradis. And this paradis is where everything, all of the stock that is really fine and old and rare is kept. Once they go into glass, not much more is taking place. We've arrested oak maturation. So each of these wicker baskets represents a snapshot in history, a snapshot in time of the way that the distillate was made back then. They could be used in blends for fine and rare bottlings, or even bottled as they are. So just to show you some of the different styles of Armagnac, let's begin with the Blanche. So Blanche is quite unusual. This doesn't really exist for cognac, and it is effectively an unaged Armagnac. It is just an incredible cocktail ingredient, and I can't encourage you enough to explore it in an Armagnac version of a French 75, or I absolutely adore a Blanche Armagnac martini made with a white vermouth. It's so tasty. Moving on, we've got VS, meaning very special. This is Armagnacs of 1 year or more. And remember, an Armagnac in bottle may well be a blend, and these age statements simply tell you that there can be nothing less than that year in them, so nothing less than that age. So when we say a minimum of 1 year, a VS could be older than that, it could be a blend of stocks that are older than that, but nothing younger. Just like with cognac, you'll see age statements like VSOP and XO also, even Orage. And VS, VSOP and XO all represent English words, you know, very special, very superior old pale, extra old. The English loved to come to France and pick up wines and distillates, and this is the way that they would order their eau de vie. So very superior old pale simply tells us that there is nothing here that is less than 4 years. And then we've got XO, extra old, meaning minimum 10 years. Orage is also a minimum of 10, but it means beyond age. And if a house has an XO and an Orage, then the Orage is likely to contain perhaps a slightly older selection of eau de vie, perhaps a slightly rarer selection of eau de vie. And then we come to something that is really unique in Armagnac, and that is their vintages. I always do a tremendous selection of fine and rare Armagnacs from mothballed or completely lost distilleries. But when you see a vintage, it will have the year that the wines were vinified on the label. And this is, you know, it's a snapshot in time. As I said, these things can be just wonderful. They must also be a minimum of 10 years old in order to qualify as a vintage. And quite often these traditional vintage styles will be wines that have been made using no sulfur, using perhaps not even any purchased yeast. These are often made using entirely natural yeasts. And one that I first tasted had been distilled and from distillation strength put directly into barrel, whereas many spirits are reduced before they go into barrel with water. And then as it had matured, it had lost alcohol over that time and it had been bottled at barrel strength. For me, it was a spirit that had just such incredible purity, and to taste a spirit that is nothing more than its raw material, fermented, distilled and matured with absolutely nothing added at any point in production was remarkable and, yeah, incredible. So thank you so much for coming to watch this Armagnac 101. It's been a pleasure to spend this time with you. Please do get in touch with me if you would like to know anything more about Armagnac. I'm very happy to come to cocktail bars in London and give you an Armagnac education for your whole team. Just say the word. My email is hannah@themixingclass.com, and you can find me in all the usual places online. All right, thank you so much,